Welcome to Africa's Vision Network. My name is Omar Ashaka, your guest host. The title of our program is Blues Knocking on America's Door. We have two very special guests with us tonight. To my left is Mr. Ray Thompson, my immediate left. My far left is Mr. Timothy States. Welcome to both of you guys. It's been about 10 years since the last time you were on the show, but it was a really thrilling program to have such intellectual stimulation from both of you guys. And I know it's going to be the same today. The title of the show, Blues Knocking on America's Door, that came from my reflection on the year 2017. Even though we're just in November, we still have 45 or so days left. It's been a blue year, 2017, in my opinion. And that's why I said blues knocking on America's door. Because there's been a lot of sadness, bad politics, racism, man hating man, woman hating woman, poverty. And what concerns me most of all is a potential nuclear war. And just very recently, we had an episode in China where some basketball players were arrested for shoplifting. So I want to talk about that as well. Then there was one other sad event that occurred in Niger with Sergeant Johnson, who was a bandit. But we'll talk about that a little bit later, because that's close to my heart because I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Niger. But Ray, share with our audience, when you hear blues knocking on America's door, what comes to your mind?
I think the thing that's foremost in the minds of a lot of Americans is how we're taking a step back in so many areas that we've made progress in over the decades. Everything from environmental protection to rights for all Americans, where we actually have tried to live up to our creed, one nation with liberty and justice for all. There have been those who have, for the longest time, resented the fact that America opened up and was inclusive of all its people. And they have worked overtime to put themselves in a position of power where they could turn this around. They're intelligent and they're effective. They know that they could not go against government, so you run for office and become government, you can destroy it from within. And so what you see taking place now is all those gains we've made in so many areas are step by step being unraveled.
Okay. I'm sorry, Ray. Can you quickly, so that our audience can get a grasp and a clear understanding as to what you're saying, can you give me a brief profile of those Americans that think the way you just described?
Well, those who have had privilege for a long time, some have a feeling of manifest destiny because the way that history has been altered, and it's not those Americans per se that are the cause of the problem, they're just a symptom. The cause of the problem starts with your educational system that tells you that only certain groups of people historically have made any type of contributions to humankind. So people feel they have a birthright to certain things. Now we're in a technological age where a lot of jobs that you could count on are going away. Technology can do the same thing in a lot of areas that a person used to do. And if you get a skillful leader who comes into power, who plays the front against the middle and says the reason that you're doing bad is because of that guy, that's what's going on.
Okay. And I'm sorry, Ray, you mentioned powerful leader. Can you give me an example?
We can start with the president, and then we can look at all those who followed his model across the board, where they're using the same strategy to get themselves in power.
Okay.
The people who vote for him, they're afraid. You know, they have mortgages they can't pay. They're facing possible unemployment. And then all you have to do is find someone that you can point to as the cause of your problem, play the front against the middle, and then next thing you know, you have the same type of situation that you saw in countries decades before. Germany is a prime example of that.
Okay. And so we're talking about President Trump. Let me ask Tim, blues knocking on America's door. What goes through your mind and your heart when you hear that?
There's quite a bit that goes through my mind. Mainly, what I hear is that in America, we're now reevaluating our values, our beliefs, and our goals. And that's causing a certain amount of consternation. And so we're being challenged on each of those. And so basically, America is having a question that basically we need to answer, what is America and what will America be going forward? Do we really want a true democracy? Do we really want true capitalism where everyone has potential for economic growth? Or do we want it where just a few, the 1%? And generally, as we're shaking all of that out, it's causing major problems. And individuals and groups start to attack each other because everyone's concerned about their specific well-being and not the country as a whole.
Good point, that last point there. So let me ask you, in your opinion, which group would be the most vulnerable group?
I think that's a great question. I think the group that is most vulnerable is the group that does not have an economic base, that you can not only provide jobs for your community, you can create dollars and businesses that continue to turn over, and your economics are constantly growing. So the group on the bottom that, or the group that will stay on the bottom, is the group that lacks the economic base. Because again, if you look at what's happening in America, it's those with capital are the ones that are going forward and benefiting, and maybe even doing harm to groups that do not have capital.
Translation too, would that group be the African American group?
I say that group is Black America, those of African descent, yes.
Okay. Now, Ray, because you're from Lexington, Kentucky,
Lexington, Kentucky.
and I
yes.
know you were sharing with me the example of where materialism kind of play a role. Someone may have a $40,000 Cadillac. Pick up
Yeah. Where I come from, Kentucky, because you have more land there than people who want it, so as a commodity is dirt cheap. You may see someone selling 40 acres of land for $60,000. But you'll see also the same type of discussions in black communities like Lexington, Kentucky, as what you see in the Bronx in New York, Washington, D.C., where we feel like we're losing ground to others. The difference is in the D.C. area, a row house will cost $500,000 or $600,000. In Kentucky, you can buy a standalone home for $60,000. You have the $50,000 Buick that they give you 4 to 7 years to pay for, but yet you don't own a home. So some of these are self-inflicted wounds because, well, one, it's easier to get like a loan for a car, I do know that, but also you don't realize that part of your power, economic power, as Tim talks about, comes from also land ownership, not things that depreciate. If you don't know the difference between a liability and an asset, and a lot of times school doesn't teach that. You know, you're taught to be an employee is what you're taught to a large degree in most of your schools. And so some fundamental things we can do to help offset the racism that prevents us from getting in jobs to begin with. What you do have, be willing to take some of that money, pay yourself first, but also make sure that you start to educate your children so we have a whole new generation that comes along that's not focused on what do you do and where do you work.
And that's an interesting point. But look, because we really want to break this down, because some of these things, even though we just started, are some of the same things we talked about 10 years ago. And for me, it's kind of a challenge because it's like it appears as though we're not moving forward. But to understand the value of land, where does that education start? And I'm going to come to you, Tim, because I look at these hardworking seniors who pass away, but they worked hard to keep their homes. They pass them on to the children, and before you know it, they've lost their homes. So Tim, you want to?
Well, I think that's an excellent point. But before we can really focus on the economic side of it, I think we have to take a look at the culture, and we have to redefine our culture. Because when you control your culture, you set up a belief system to what we believe in, you talk about what our goals are, and also what we will tolerate within that culture. And because we don't control our culture, we've allowed outsiders via marketing to come in and tell our people that that $40,000 Buick is more important than owning the land, which is going to appreciate over time in general. And even if it doesn't appreciate, it's an asset that you can use to leverage and acquire other assets. But if we had control over our culture that said we're not going to go for instant gratification, we're going to work on building things. And you build things by having assets, by, again, getting back to the entire economic piece. See, so I believe really if we look at black folks here in America, we really have to get control of two things. It's our culture and our economics. And then some may say the economics will derive from the culture. So I believe that culture is so important.
Okay, Tim, culture, kind of define that in the context in which you're indicating there.
As
You're
I
talking
said,
about the African-American culture, you're talking about the American culture, or?
okay, the African-American culture. Okay, we as African-Americans have to define what it is as black people we believe in. And again, what is acceptable within our communities. We have to say, look, this is not our culture. One of the things I remember throughout the 90s, and even today, when you'd have some of the hip hop artists would come in and defend some of their negative behavior with, well, that's our culture. And that's not our culture, that's street culture. We have to make sure we differentiate between black culture, street culture, and any of these other cultures. And within our culture, we have to define where family fits in, the role of the family, the role of the fathers, the role of the mothers, the children, and what we do in the education. All of that falls under the cultural aspect.
Well, let me examine street culture for a moment, Ray. I thought about the rappers when you were talking. I'm amazed at the amount of money that they're able to gather up or establish. You know, whether it's a Jay-Z, Puff Daddy, and even the drug dealers, they seem to have a formula for generating income, but it's the negative, not the rappers per se, but we know that some of these drug folks, to be these big kingpins, they're doing something with money. And I guess what I'm saying is that skill, because obviously I think it takes some kind of skill set,
Right.
but it seems like it's working in a negative area rather than a positive. But what would you say about that?
Well, you know, something's interesting about that. Some years ago, C. Dolores Tucker, she actually, if you recall, she purchased stock Time Warner, went to a board meeting, and raised a ruckus. She asked one of the CEOs to read some of the lyrics in the music that they were producing. What she had done, she had actually talked to some of the rappers. She said, how come you guys are putting out lyrics that depict black women in a very negative manner and just our society in a negative way? They said, when we try to do other things, they veto us. So that's telling you right there, someone had an agenda. Let the artist be an artist. Why does the music have to go down a certain line? Because you remember when a lot of the rap music first came out, it was about political commentary, social commentary. Some of it would be just like fun lyrics and such, but then it started taking a more gangster type of image. So the answer to that I don't know, but there was obviously something going on. There were certain artists were vetoed, and others were allowed to go through. If you don't do things, and that's true with artists across the board, if you don't do the things the way I want you to do it, then you won't record, period. And so behind that, you got people with the power to help market your product. Nowadays with the internet, a lot of the young kids are able to do it with that, but prior to that, you had to have someone to market what you were producing.
Well, Tim, I think earlier we were talking about the lack of control, and I even used the term puppet. I guess the frustration for me is, and I know sometimes there's this thinking that white is always right. Now, God made all people, but no particular group is superior over another group. But I guess what I find interesting is that when Reverend Fauntleroy was on the show, I asked Reverend Fauntleroy, does he think that one day black people will be extinct? He said no, he doesn't think so. But as we were talking off camera, you got the killings by way of shootings, the drug dealing, the prison population, the homosexuality. I just don't see how, and I'm a positive thinking person and I have faith, but boy, it just gets me a little worked up because of what I see. Can you comment on that, Tim? And I know I said a few things there.
Well, one of the things, again, I think we have to reestablish what our culture and belief system actually is. So by doing that, it will ensure that we're around down the road. When you talk about will we be extinct, I guess you're saying, will the continuation of all of the negative things that are eliminating us?
Right, and for example, I always use, and I've talked about this many years on the show, will we become like the American Indian?
Okay, and actually there are groups and people that believes. One of the things I think is important, and this just happened a few days ago, was the FCC ruled that now corporations can not only own television stations, but they can also own newspapers. So basically, you have the opportunity as a major corporation, and generally they're very conservative, that they can control the media, not only the broadcast and the print media. Now, how does that affect black people? Dr. Frances Cress Welsing, in the past, I heard her say that there are some similarities between Nazi Germany and what is happening here. And she said, so one of the first things that is done is you demean people. So you look at all the caricatures that the conservative news has made of black folks, and now they're going to have more control. And then when you demean it, you show people that, well, maybe they're not worthy of existence and getting rights. And so then maybe that does lead to extinction. Now, I think our role of that in that is if we redefine our culture and we take control of our economic base, then we will make ourselves stronger.
Okay. Now, good point about redefining our culture. I want to come back to that. But Ray, a couple observations that I had to kind of tie into some of the things that Tim said. I look at a lot of photos and I look at a lot of commercials. And a number of times I don't see the dark complexion African American.
Right. Mm-hmm.
It's like the commercials are getting lighter and lighter.
Right. Again. Right.
Tim mentioned broadcasting. Now that's scary because we know TVs now, from what I understand, there's been some reports that these TVs can kind of monitor you in your own home. And I found some things to be kind of coincidental, or I found myself asking, well, Omar, do they know you? When I see some of these commercials that come on, they seem to be applicable to some of my needs. So that's really scary about the television, because that's right in your home, and a lot of people, that's the least thing they would think about, is that somebody is using some form of control over you. But Ray, what are your thoughts in terms of reestablishing and redefining our culture?
Well, I think one of the first things that's important is you have to know where you come from. Our history did not begin and end with slavery. Whenever we talk about Black History Month, we always speak about slavery. We don't go back to ancient cultures like the Egyptians. The Egyptians were the ones that the Greeks and Romans took some of their initial knowledge from. Socrates and Plato both studied in Egypt. Pythagoras theorem, Euclidean algorithms, those men, they both studied in Egypt. But once you defeat a people, if you want to keep them from becoming whole, you deny them their history. And everywhere from Australia to the American Indians, people would take children and re-indoctrinate them, put them in camps where I teach you my ways. And after so many decades, you can get people to hate the very skin that they're in. And so that's why, and you're dealing with intelligent people who know that once they control access to information, they can have this go any direction they want to, for political reasons or to make money. Both.
Well, that's interesting. When you were talking, I thought about the Redskins, the Washington Redskins, a professional football team. At one time, there was a little battle over the name, but it looks like the organization may be successful and that name is not going to change. But I got to admit, sometimes I look at the people who are playing for the Washington Redskins, and I wonder sometimes about their thought process, knowing how the American Indian was treated and how African Americans were treated. It just seems like there would be some degree of sensitivity. Now, I'm not naive. I know that dollars will, just smack away anything that makes sense in sensitivity. So, Tim, you want to comment on that?
Well, first, I'd like to say, getting back to the history part that Ray mentioned, I do believe that is very important, that we've got to recognize we didn't begin here in enslavement. And even actually, I have stopped using the word slavery because that gives off the connotations as if we were actively pursuing a profession. We were enslaved. So I think it's important that we state that. But when you speak of the educational aspect, I like to think of Carter G. Woodson's book, Miseducation of a Negro. And there are so many nuggets in that book, but one of the things that stands out to me is that Carter G. Woodson mentions that we are given two educations, a formal education and an informal education. And he says the informal education has a far greater influence on you in your life if you take it and use it the right way. So even though we aren't getting the correct information, it is on us to seek out the knowledge like other groups do to inform themselves. And let's say not every Black person has the ability to do that, but we need to somehow form groups that, again, it's getting back to redefining our culture, that we can teach and say, hey, look, here's our history. As he said, the Egyptians were teaching math, and what the other people did is they came in and rebranded it and just basically stole it. They didn't create it. They put their brand on it. And so our people need to know, no, we had universities, and we taught from math to science, and even the beginning of religion started, the spirituality aspect in Africa.
Well, this might be a great time to pivot into the role of the church. And in the history, I mean, believe me, I can appreciate all that, and I know it's necessary. Again, and I'm just trying to be a straight shooter here, but what disturbs me and what concerns me, I think that's a better word, is we've said a number of these things for a long period of time. When we were off camera, I said I wish I'd brought a clock.
Yeah.
and I hope that I'm wrong, but I just feel like sometimes time is running out on African American people. And again, I want to repeat why I said that. Look at the shootings. Look at all the killings in Chicago. I mean, I was in St. Louis. I was in Memphis, D.C. I thought I was in the same place because of what was going on with the killings.
Right.
And look, I've even found myself thinking, how is it that you can have the exact same pattern? And I know slavery is part of our history, but you almost have the exact same pattern. I'm in St. Louis. I'm looking at TV. The only thing I had to remind myself, look, you're not in Washington, D.C., Omar, you're in St. Louis. I'm in Memphis. I had to remind myself, Omar, you're not in D.C. or St. Louis, you're in Memphis. The exact same pattern of killings. And again, I know there's a correlation with redefining our culture. But you know what I found myself thinking? And there was a movie about this. I found myself wondering, is there something that's in the water? If there's something in the food? And for those who think, well, he's crazy, he doesn't know what he's talking about, I think about the Tuskegee experiment.
Right.
So, and what I'm trying to do, as I told you guys before, because we got some people out in the audience, and some people might be looking for some answers. Some people might be struggling just like I'm struggling. And so, how do we incorporate our history, but come up with a new formula that will resonate, especially with our young people, and even some of our seniors?
Right. Well, I say one key thing that we have to do is we have to stop being trifling and making excuses. And by that, I've had friends, you mentioned someone like Paul Robeson, and I've had friends tell me, well, they don't teach our children about people like Paul Robeson. Well, nowadays you have video discs. You can do that yourself. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to expose your children to these things. Then when you live in a metropolitan area like D.C. in particular, there's always things centering around our culture to take your kids to. Mm-hmm. But you'll find those who refuse to be trifling and be proactive and do things about both their economic situation and also about teaching your children history, they'll fare well because you got the intellect and the ability. But if your goal is to only make an excuse, then you never get out of that situation. And even if the excuse you have is valid, you can be in a job and you say, I've been here for 11 years, they never promote me. That might be true, but why did you stay? You have to be proactive. So I think one of the things we have to do is stop allowing people to make excuses for not voting. And then one of the reasons that you have across this country people who have gotten in power using fear-mongering is because we do not come out to vote. And I've had friends say, well, people feel disenfranchised, and no, you don't even look at the issues. You're not that concerned. Unless something starts to affect you directly, I think one thing about the current president, he may start to affect so many people directly that they'll get up and take some action.
And we're talking about President Trump, and I want to call him by name because 50 years from now, somebody watching this program, they don't have to try to figure out which president we're talking about.
Okay.
But Ray, does that fall into, can we bundle those things that you talked about into that category of self-inflicted wounds that you were talking about earlier?
Yeah, self-inflicted wounds. Economics, for example, which Tim talks about. First off, you have to talk, starting at a young age, to young people about what to do with a dollar. That doesn't mean going out and buying your young child a $1,000 cell phone and not having a penny set aside for their future education. You can open up stock accounts for children now as an adult and show them at an early age how to get money to work for you. It's not difficult. And so you have to do things like this. And then with the churches, where they come into play, people in our community, we trust the church. If something is presented by the pastor in the church, they'll say, I don't know much about it, but Pastor so-and-so says, okay, I'm going to do it. What you do, you get some of the people in your church to teach classes during the week, on how to protect your wealth as you get older, so you don't lose your home, and how to get young people to get involved in organizations that teach them how to start businesses. So learned behavior can be unlearned, but there has to be a starting point.
Very interesting point, Ray. I know with my oldest daughter, I got her some stock in Wendy's, and I used to tell her, don't go to McDonald's, you go to Wendy's. And it's not how many shares you got. If you got one share, in my opinion, you got a right to vote. But Ray, real quick, for those individuals in our audience who may have heard you mention Paul Robeson, but they don't know who he is, can you briefly share a little bit about Paul Robeson? Just a little bit there, and then we'll go to Tim.
Paul Robeson was a black man. He was a Rhodes Scholar. He was an actor. He was a singer. He was also a statesman. He was a threat because he went totally against the images that were projected of black people as being ignorant and incapable. In his later years in life, he was banned from leaving the country because he was respected, all around the world. They say the Welsh have a statue of him. He had actually gone over and managed to get boxcars of food provided to the people there when the English tried to basically starve out some of the coal miners and such there. So he was respected all over the world. He spoke out against inequities, and because of that, he was banned from leaving the country. He was a dangerous man. That's why you don't see anything about him much in your standard history books. That's why we have to teach these things.
And thank you for that educational piece on Paul Robeson. Tim.
Well, excuse me.
Sure.
Can I just add a couple of things
Sure.
about Paul Robeson?
Okay.
Paul Robeson was also an All-American athlete while at Rutgers University. He graduated Phi Beta Kappa. He's a graduate of law school. He went on to law school, in addition to all of the things Ray mentioned. And my belief has always been, one, that Paul Robeson was truly a Renaissance man. But if
Exactly.
Paul Robeson was a white man, you'd have buildings, books, everything named after that guy. He's just totally a well-rounded individual who maximized his intellect and all of his other abilities. I just wanted to put that in there.
And thank you, Tim. Now, I kind of jotted down a question. Aren't we all, God has given all of us gifts. And even though we may not be the best Renaissance man, the other thing I try to put out there is that we all have a gift that God has given us, and we all have a responsibility to make our world better, especially within the African American community, because the people who pave the dues of death for us to go into, whether it's restaurants or whatever, so we got to give back, in particular for our children. Now, Blues Knocking on America's Door, we also talked about man hating man. Ray, can you comment on that man hating man, whether it's a white man hating a black man, whether it's a black man hating a black man, et cetera? Any thought on that?
Man hating man, I think a lot of times it comes down to perceptions we have about other people. We oftentimes look at the black-white dynamic in America. When I was in the Navy, I spent 2 years up in Maine. And it's so cold up there, I didn't see many people who looked like me. But what I did experience was people in a different social economic class who had money that went way back, in many cases, generations. And they looked down upon the local people there who they made their living off of the sea, but they were like dirt farmers would be in other parts of the country. And they would tell their own children, well, baby, we don't hang with those kind of people. They different than us. In some areas, in Kentucky, where I come from, people refer to other human beings as trash. Some of that same type mentality was taking place in Europe before folks came over here. So it just continued on. And so, we as human beings, for whatever reason, we always find some way to take a group and somehow try to disenfranchise them and to keep them in what we feel to be their place, Now, what happens is over a period of time, people start to believe that they have a place. And they'll refer to themselves as terms like minority and things like there's power in words. In the world community, we're not a minority. We're the predominant group. But words have a limiting effect on. It's like a form of hypnosis almost. You know, or you see yourself as an employee. Once you're an employee, then you're always got to be controlled.
Tim, what are your thoughts on it?
Well, and I agree that words are powerful. So I want to go back to the trifling. You said our people, and I don't see our people as trifling. I see that we have been beaten down psychologically, and a sense of hopelessness has set in, and a sense of I can't achieve. And so I believe words are very powerful, and I think we have to be careful with the labels that we put on each other, particularly within our group. And so, Omar, when you asked earlier question, was time running out? For me personally, what gives me hope is I look back on that enslavement period where we were enslaved for over 250 years. And I'm sure at some point in year 100, our people thought we may never get out of this, and we were able to get through it. So I use that as a beacon of light. And you also asked, was there something in the water? And I say, yeah. You said you go to all these different cities and you see the same thing. I would say, first, it starts in the educational system. You go to all these different cities, our people are getting the same subpar education, okay, and being taught to hate ourselves, okay, to look down on each other. So, I mean, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure that out. But I think what we have to do is we have to, again, understand that there's a concerted effort out there to make these things happen. I mean, and also that if there was a real issue or concern, it'd be a health crisis. You just look at the opioid crisis now. That has crept into the white community, and it has been defined as a national health crisis because you have whites who are now doing overdoses on drugs and they're killing themselves.
A good point, Tim. But let me go back to, and I appreciate that beacon of light.
Could I just say one thing to clarify? With what I said about trifling, I should add a third category. Like the Bible says, my people perish for lack of knowledge. There are folks who don't know. But without having to do a study, since I am black, grew up in the black community, there are people that I've talked to about things that we need to do, and they'll tell you, I don't have time for that. That's what I'm referring to when I speak of trifling.
That's that.
And these are folks who, unless it affects them directly, they're not going to vote. They're part of my community, they're my brothers, they're my sisters. But based on, if you sit there and the ship's sinking, you're not bailing water. That's what I mean by that term.
Well, let me just make sure I'm clear too, is that what you perceive as trifling, it's that sense of hopelessness that's set in, that the people don't feel like they can make a difference. And I think one of the biggest con games that has been run on black people is this whole voting. Okay, everyone has told us to vote, and if you go and look, we have more politicians than we ever had, and yet our condition seems to continue to regress. Our focus should be on economics, because even in the political game now,
you're right about
it's
the
all about
economics.
money. Let me just say this, because with Citizens United in 2010, basically gave individuals the right to make unlimited contributions to political campaigns. So basically, those who have money are those who ideas are being passed, even with our own people.
But let me jump in, Tim, because two things. When we mentioned the subpar educational system, what came to my mind, I made a little note here, because we do have African Americans, black people who are making money, but those who don't want to go back to the neighborhood, if you will, because they think they've arrived. You talked about the black politicians. I think we should vote. And like you said, even though we may not progress like we should when we get these black politicians, my issue is perhaps it's the black politicians that we're voting for. I look at Jack Johnson, who was the Prince George's County executive in Maryland. went to prison. I look at the gentleman who was the mayor down in Atlanta, Georgia, many years ago. I can't think of his name. He's gone to prison. Now, I know that the system sometimes can send people to jail and they don't deserve to go. But perhaps other than just educating people about the vote, we also have to make sure people, just because you're black don't mean you're the person I'm supposed to vote for. And I tell you one that I was offended by as a Maryland resident. I was offended when Lieutenant Governor Michael Steele, at that time he was a candidate, put in our neighborhood, helped elect Michael Steele to make history. My thought when I read that, I'm not voting for somebody just to make history. You know, my family and people in the community, they need more than just to make history. So we have to be very careful as to who we vote for. And it is amazing how, look, a gentleman I used to work with in Newport News, Virginia, with the NAACP, and I have a lot of respect for him, Congressman Bobby Scott. He's still there. But I remember sometimes my brothers would come up, we'd go to some of these parties. Mm-hmm. And I remember they were talking about the women. I mean, it was like party time more so than anything. Now, I'm not saying all congressmen are that way. But we really have to make sure when we vote, just don't vote just to make history and just because somebody's black.
Right. Well, can I say
Sure.
this? First of all, I want to be clear. I'm not saying we shouldn't vote, but what I'm saying is we've been misled to believing voting is going to take us to our salvation. See, if you can imagine, if we put as much energy that we do in discussing voting and politics and discussing business, can you imagine where the black community would be? Okay, so we tend to tell everybody it's your duty to vote. Get out there, do. We say people died. We're not honest. People were killed for us to have the right to vote. Okay, and so basically, if we took that same resourcefulness and said, it's your duty to do business, it's your duty to go out and start a business, to be economically superior. Mm-hmm. Can you imagine what our community would look like?
I think both you guys are right. We really have to do both. And Ferguson, Missouri is a prime example where money was being made off the back of black folk who were getting convictions for parking violations and such. And when voting was brought up as one remedy because they were the majority, we were the majority population, a lot of folks said, well, this isn't about voting. It is when you have people in who have agendas who don't include you, or even worse, agendas that target you as a community. So at the same time, you get people off your back by having folks who don't have those agendas against your community. Tim's right, you also have to have economic empowerment. Now, one of the things I do with a lot of the kids that I come in contact with is I have them read a book. This book is called The Richest Man in Babylon. This book was written in 1926 by a guy named George Clason. The first time I got the book, it was before Amazon.com, and I couldn't find it in a bookstore anywhere. And it happened to be up in Montreal, and the book found me. And when I checked out, the lady at the counter, she said, "Is this a good book?" I said, "Oh, no, I've been looking for it, and it found me." You know what she said? She said, "I was just curious. We have a conference of millionaires who meet here every year. They always discuss this book." I said, "Okay, good enough for them, good enough for me." I would buy 10 copies of the book every time I got paid and give them away. You're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. With kids in the family, I would, when they turned 18, I would get them to open up an account with a company. There are a lot of them out there now. I use one called E-Trade. I think Capital One Bank owns it now. It's called Capital One Investing. But I would go out there and give them $100, open up an account. It's free to open it up. It stays in existence for free. And I'd give them to buy their first stock, get them started.
Well, see, Ray and Tim, that's why I mentioned too about our special gifts that God has given us. Because it's not just going to be economics, it's going to be education, it's going to be health. I put down here love and respect. Maybe this is where the church come from. So there are a whole lot of areas that I think is required for us to try to cover for us to be the strong people that we're supposed to be.
Right.
Now, we talked about woman hating woman. And Tim, you and I'll let Tim lead off with this response. We talked about that. Share with our audience what comes to your mind when you hear that.
Well, when I hear women hating women, I think of basically, are women supporting each other? And so I look at the feminist movement and black women's role. Black women as a whole will take part and be very supportive, but then that support isn't reciprocated. When you look at the sister out of Florida who's being under attack by President Trump and his people, where were the white feminists defending her? When you look at a Chandra Bland and her murder, where were the white feminists? So I think the women hating women basically gets back to saying reciprocity and let's reciprocate if we're going to have love, and if it's not, then it must be hate. That's what I hear.
Okay. And just to add, the reason we say woman hating woman in that blues context, so just wanted to kind of point that out. Ray, any comment on that?
Well, I think you get the same dynamic when you start talking about racism with the men as you do with the women. You know, when you start talking about some of the remedy programs that were put in place at one time to try to address, you know, people being excluded from, say, the workplace, say the remedy of affirmative action, it got to the point where it actually provided a lot of opportunity for white women. You know, people don't like to admit that, but it actually did. I think that in the black women are actually opening more businesses now than just about any group because people are feeling disenfranchised. You know, we're taught that if you work hard, get good grades in school, you get a so-called good job, and you live happily ever after. But we know that when you get into the workplace, women deal with dynamic of, especially black women, one of being non-white and also being a woman. And so they're qualified, so they're opening up businesses now. I just went to a conference, empowerment conference I was invited to. It was in Pasadena, Maryland on Friday, where you had all these black women who've started their businesses and they're networking together, you know? And I think that one thing that's happening as people feel disenfranchised, we come from people who are creative. We're looking at these vehicles that our system provides, because the American system provides an opportunity for you to actually achieve a certain amount of financial security if you're receptive to the message. It's one of the reasons why people break their neck and do everything possible to sometimes get here. You can start out with nothing and become something. And so I think that we're seeing, even though it's picking up momentum, more and more of us realizing there's another dimension out there besides work. Work has limitations. And when you have also this other dynamic where people who are oftentimes victims themselves being taught that they're superior, and you're going to keep me down to a certain level. And
Well-
so I think we're starting to see where it's going to take more and more of this happening, where more people not only embrace what they have to do to get out of this tractor beam, but also it's our duty to pass it on to others and to other generations if people are receptive.
Now, you mentioned other generations, Ray. You know, I just did this circle, and one of the things I talked about, love and respect. And I'm going to pass this on to Tim. Because in order to have other generations, you have to have marriages or
Right.
relationships typically. Let's talk. This was not in the song that we kind of came up with, but what about, you mentioned this successful women. What about, Tim, when it comes to relationships, in particular the African American man and African American woman? Now we know that there's a lot of interracial marriages now that are occurring, and that's a touchy subject. Hopefully we can have a program on that. We know that love is supposed to be colorblind, and perhaps President Obama, his story may have had some impact. But what do you think about that, Tim? Um, I was talking to someone the other day, and they said, an old friend, she said, yeah, my daughter has two kids, two daughters. One is black and one is white. At first, I thought she was talking about twins. You know, there's been something in the news where they were twins, and one child
Right.
was black and
Remember
one
that
was,
years ago.
was white. But they have two separate fathers. But what are your thoughts on relationships, Tim?
Well, I just believe first, in love, we have to define love and say what really is love, because people have so many different meanings. And in relationships, we have to make sure that not only do we say we love people, but we have to show we love people. We forget sometimes that it's not necessarily what you say, but also what you do. And so it's sort of like if you love someone, you can say it, and those can be empty words, but it's your actions. So we have to do that. We have to also be open to accept love. A lot of times, from role modeling, from our history, that we can feel and say we want love, but we may not be open to that. And so I think all of that, again, ties back to my original statement, our culture, that we can even define that. What is love within our culture? What does it mean? Like other groups. Mm-hmm. You look at other groups who may do prearranged marriages, and I'm not promoting that, but they basically decide family, love, religion, all of that.
But does a culture continuously evolve? And let me just say this, because I just got a 5-minute cue. One of the things you and I were talking about off camera, Tim, was how a number of our prominent African American / black leaders are married to Caucasian women. And I believe you were sharing some information. I'm not sure if somebody else was writing on that, but can you briefly?
Well, I don't recall that conversation. I think
Was it you
that
then,
must
Ray?
have been Ray.
No, it wasn't, but I do have some comments on
Okay.
it. I think it's the reason that you choose someone. People sometimes meet people and they fall in love with them and have a relationship with that person based on that. But if you show that every person that you pick doesn't look like you, because when you start talking about black males, a lot of times, remember back to controversial Will Chamberlain? We can even talk about Tiger Woods and certain patterns of behavior that almost say, without you even saying anything, that you don't feel that a black woman meets your standards of beauty. You know, oftentimes we just define beauty, it's defined as being European, you know, the thin nose and all this. That's what happens when you have been defeated in battle. People define your images for you.
Yeah, and Ray, and Tim, I thought I'd share with you because I thought you said that someone was saying you can't fight for black rights if you're married to a white
Oh,
woman.
we had a discussion, and that's what someone said. But let me just say this.
Okay, and we got it.
Okay, I'll speed it up.
Okay.
Is that I disagree with you can't help who you fall in love with, because you can. It starts with who do you date? Who do you go out with? You can decide if I'm going to go out with this person or that person. So I don't think love sneaks up on you and bites you out of nowhere. There are things you do. And personally,
I'm just saying.
I think people do whatever they decide, and that's on them. For me, I would only date an African American and a black woman.
Yeah.
But other people, that's their
Now,
decision.
my wife is a black woman, but one thing I say, I don't get in grown folks' business, but there's a pattern, something we have to discuss when people get to a point, because they will only date white men or only date white women. That says sometimes that inferiority complex that you have, sometimes when you see the pattern over and over again, 10, 15 times, that says something else. might be
Self-hate,
going
I
on.
think that's a lot of
Exactly,
self-hate.
Well,
yeah.
But I'm not sure if it's self-hate for everybody who falls in love with somebody who's different.
No.
Now, I had a college buddy. His fiance, she had red hair, and she was white, and he was black. And I'll never forget how he told me. He said, "Man, I love my wife," but it appeared as though it was something in their heart. And I guess the question, what I was going to say too, if we do, and let me be clear. I've always wanted someone who remind me of my mother. So everybody, there's a French proverb, chacun son goût. But for me, I always wanted someone like my mother because she worked real hard to raise 4 hard-headed boys. But if we want equal rights, and this is probably a whole nother show, but if someone falls in love with someone else, and I don't have the answer, but I know that that's a hot button, and because I know that for black African-American women, sometimes it's already a challenge to find a good man, and maybe especially a man of color sometimes. But at any rate, let me move on because I know the time. I probably shouldn't have touched that and waited just for another show because I found myself struggling. Look like I'm going to have to wrap it up. But Ray and Tim, we are just so happy to have you guys here, and because you remind me of someone either on CNN or, I mean, there should be a show with just Ray and Tim. Okay.
Well, it's good. It's good to be back, right, Tim?
Yeah.
It is.
So-
It's great to be able to be back.
Be back.
But God bless you guys, and we'll be doing another show, and thank you very much for your input because it was definitely very stimulating, and I really appreciate you guys coming back.
Thank you.
Thank you, Omar.
Okay.
Knocking on America's door. Blue, knocking on America's door. Trying to live a day where I ask confusion not to come my way. Bad politics, racism, shooting, poverty, man hating man, woman hating woman. Worst of all, a potential nuclear war, a mind-twisting chore. Blues knocking on America's door. Blues knocking on America's door. God bless our Gold Star family. And let me say that again. God bless our Gold Star family, for they have sacrificed their son or their daughter, another loved one, for our peace and freedom. God bless our Gold Star family. Blues knocking, knocking, knocking on America's door. Blues, 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 knocking on America's door. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.